Is your scrap bin overflowing like mine? Oh, that was a terrible idea. Oh, good. Okay. But anyway, have you accumulated a massive amount? Oh my God, they're attached to me. For real though, do you have way too many scraps or small cuts of fabric and you have no idea what to do with them? One of my favorite things to do with all of my new sewists at the studio is strip piecing. This is a scrap-tastic project that will make use of tons of scrap in your bin. You can make this pillow as small or as large as you want. It's a variation on a rail fence quilt block, so there's different strips going in different directions, and it can be made much more complicated or much more easy depending on how big you want to make this pillow. My name is Julia. I'm the owner of Old Spool Sewing Studio, and today I'm going to show you how to do a scrappy strip-pieced pillow project. The items that you will need to create your strip-pieced project are as follows. A massive amount of scraps, preferably in widths or lengths no smaller than 6 inches. I've pre-cut a few scraps, and if you happen to get one of my sewing kits, you will have a bunch of pre-cut 2 by 6 inch scraps yourself, but you just need a bunch of different sizes of scraps. And for this project, it really helps if you pull a lot of scraps from the same color family. So if you look here, I have a lot of cool colors, browns and creams. You can also make this more interesting by sorting your blocks into cool colors and warm colors. There are so many different options. Once you have all your scraps together, you're also going to need a rotary cutter and a hard edge ruler. If you do not have these, we're going to talk about an alternative way to cut your strips and cut your pillow and square everything off without a rotary cutter and a ruler. I often don't let students under 18 use this because it is a razor blade. Think of a pizza cutter, but a little bit more dangerous. Also, you're going to want a pair of good fabric scissors, your pins, thread to match your project, and all of the notions you need to use your sewing machine, like your bobbins, your needle, your thread, your snips, and all the good stuff. Also, don't forget my handy dandy seam ripper, because we're gonna make mistakes during this project because we're learning, and it is always good to have a seam ripper to be able to fix our mistakes. If you don't have a rotary cutter and a hard edge ruler to complete your project, you're going to want to get some paper. Basic computer paper will work really well, but I also always have these big rolls of tracing paper around, a pair of paper scissors, a pencil, and a ruler. Now, I love my clear see-through ruler because it is easy to use and easy to draw square and straight lines with. If you don't have one of these, we're going to talk about different ways, and there's lots of different ways that you can work on drawing square lines. Don't forget that you're also going to need your fluff, and at the very end, a hand sewing needle to sew your project closed. First off, take all of your scraps, and if any of them are extra crumply and wrinkly like this, it's a no-go. So you're gonna have to pop over to the iron and iron them. Voila! How lovely, a nice and flat piece of fabric. Now you have 2 options from here on in to cut your fabric into strips. There is the much safer but harder way, and then the trickier and slightly dangerous way. I am going to use my hard edge quilting ruler and my rotary cutter to cut strips. But I don't like to let anyone under the age of 18 use a rotary cutter because this is a razor blade, and I have cut myself very, very badly before. So if you do have a rotary cutter at home, why not grab an adult and let them help you out? Or if you are an adult, be extremely careful. Make sure whenever you have your rotary cutter and your ruler out that the rotary cutter's blade is not exposed, which is why I love this ergonomic handle, because as soon as I release the handle, it hides the blade. And then I have my hand always on a nice wide ruler, and I make sure it's out of the way. The last thing you want to do is put your hand like this and slice right into it. Ask me how I know. So I'm going to cut a few with the rotary cutter to show you, and I'm going to cut them at varying widths. I'm going to do some 1.5 inches, maybe some 1.25 inches, and maybe even some 2. So let's start. I'm going to try and get a nice straight piece. Hands out of the way. Boom, got one. Let's cut another. I'll do this one 1.5 inches. Et voila, there's another one. Oh, we got a dangler, just be careful. And now let me show you what you can do if you don't have a hard edge ruler and a rotary cutter at home. So I'm gonna grab my clear see-through ruler. This one I don't use for rotary cutting because it's soft and flexible and I'll chop right into the plastic, but I love using a clear ruler for all of my pattern drafting and all of my projects. So I've got my ruler, it's a 2-inch wide ruler. I'm gonna grab one of my friction pens, and if you don't have a friction pen, a regular pencil or regular pen will work just fine. And I'm gonna trace off using the straight edge of my ruler along the straight edge of my project. So here, if I line this up with my gridded cutting mat, I'm gonna put the 1.5 inch mark, which is not this guy, but this guy, see, 1/2, 1 hole, 1 hole and a half. And I'm gonna draw some straight lines that I can then cut on with a pair of regular scissors. And we really want straight lines in this project because it's going to help us line up our strips for when we sew them together, and it'll keep our lines nice and straight. So I don't know if you can see this, it's a little hard, but I've just drawn 2 lines. I've got an 1.5 inch and a 2-inch strip here. And I'm gonna grab my fabric scissors and I'm going to cut right on that line. And remember, keep everything on the table and cut nice and straight and long so you get nice straight edges, okay? I'll cut this piece too. Now, once you have a bunch of varying strips, whether you cut them with a ruler and a pencil and your regular scissors or a rotary cutter, you're gonna wanna gather them all up and we're gonna get to designing our pillow front. As you can see here, I went and pulled all different cool colored fabrics from my scrap bins, and all of these pieces came out of my scrap bins. And really, you don't need a very big piece. They're all about, 6 inches long is what I ultimately cut them to. And you can go longer or you can go shorter if you want smaller blocks, but my blocks are gonna end up being about 5 inches big each. So I wanted to keep my strips at least 6 inches long to count for that. So I've got all these pieces. Let's make some space. Oh, excuse me. My lovely little microphone. And let's start to design one of our blocks. So I'm going to lay out some pieces, and we're going for random here. When you're doing a scrappy project, it always looks best if you go really, really random with your strips. And I'm going to grab 5 strips per block to create a block. And you know what? I'm looking at this and I don't entirely love that they're all the same width. It looks like they're all 2 inches wide. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and, personal preference, I'm gonna trim a few of these to make them different widths, but you can totally leave them all this width that they are cut, and you're actually only probably gonna need about 4 if you do that. But I wanna be able to get 5 in there, so I'm gonna cut one of my strips. So let me grab a rotary cutter, and you know what? This guy I think is gonna go a little bit skinnier. So I'm gonna lay this on here. I'm gonna make him 1.5 inches using my gridded ruler. There's a little bit skinnier of a piece. So you can go right ahead and design all of your blocks right now. You're gonna pick 5 or 6 strips a piece. If you wanna trim any of them to make them smaller, you absolutely can. Let's try and get pieces that we haven't used as much. Let's see here, a good solid color will help a lot. So here's one block up here, and then I'm starting to find pieces for another block. And you know what? Your personal style is gonna start to come out here when you start to mix and match your pieces. And sometimes you might find maybe you don't want one fabric and you want a different one. But like I said, the more random this project is, the better it looks. So go ahead and lay out 4 different groupings of your strips to make sure that you have plenty and that your patterns don't really repeat themselves. And then we're gonna get to sewing them. Here is the first layout of my first block that I'm going to create, and if you can see, I went and I trimmed a few of my strips, but again, you can leave them exactly 2 inches wide if you bought a kit. And I'm going to start sewing these together. Now, strip piecing is so easy and straightforward. All we're going to do is work piece by piece, and I actually like to work in pairs, and we're going to sew them together in pairs, and then we're going to sew them together again to create a block. So I'm going to lay everybody right side up on my work surface. I'm gonna take, let's move these guys over, we'll call this 1 and 2. Now I'm going to take strip number 2 and I'm going to flip it so that they are right sides together. And this one, you can't really tell if it has a right or wrong side because it is a solid piece. And then you are going to line up the side where the other piece was. So my strip 2 was here and I flipped it onto here. So I'm gonna line up this edge so my edges are perfectly even. You don't want anything like that. That is not even. You want nice and even. And we're gonna pin it in place. So remember, we like to pin to sew with our pins hanging off the edge like this. And I'm gonna put them about 3 fingers to a hand's distance away. And I'm gonna pin this strip perfectly. Make sure nobody is uneven. So there's my strip. I'm gonna flip it over. It looks nice and even. This is the side I care about. This is not the side I pinned, so I do not care if that is uneven. So that is nice and straight. And I'm gonna, while I'm here, I'm gonna pin these 2 as well. And if you have 5 strips in your block, you're gonna notice that you have a little extra. So we're gonna come back and we're gonna pin that guy together after we sew these 2 strip pieces together. And if you went ahead and designed all 4 of your blocks, you can go and pin as many pieces as you want. A really efficient way to work is to pin everything and then go sew everything and then come back and iron everything and then pin everything again, instead of pinning one piece, going to sew it, going to iron it, coming it back, pinning another. So it is really up to you and whatever flow works best for you. But I am now gonna hop over to my sewing machine and then we're gonna talk about how we're gonna sew these guys together. All right, so we are now going to sew our pieces together. So I'm over at my sewing machine. I've got my little snips close by. I've got my thread basket to catch all my loose threads. And of course, I've got a pin dish here with me to catch all my loose pins. So we are going to be sewing down the pinned edge of our strips. And if you're a super beginner, sewing a straight line is a little tricky, and to keep it consistent too. What I always do for my students at the studio is I will often draw a line, and I will use my friction pens because they're the ones that'll disappear, and I will use a ruler and draw myself a really nice straight line 1/4 inch in. And what you can do is take a ruler, you mark 1/4 inch, and you'll mark it all the way down. And this is obviously best done on a table, but I want to show you nice and clearly. And then we'll draw that nice straight line for us to follow. So if you need help with that, it's always helpful to ask an adult. But if you are feeling confident and you understand how to use the sewing machine to sew straight, let's try and do that now. So on my sewing machine, I have it equipped with the regular presser foot. So from where my needle is to the edge of my presser foot, if I lined up the edge of the fabric there, I'm going to sew with a 3/8 seam allowance. And a 3/8 seam allowance is actually a little bit wider than what we want for sewing. If you look at this ruler, where the blue slider is right there, that is 3/8 inch, and we actually want to be sewing about 1/4 inch. And I know it seems like such a small difference, but really it's so helpful in quilting if we can keep our seam allowances nice and light and skinny. It reduces a lot of bulk when we're sewing. So on my sewing machine, I actually know that a setting to sew a 1/4 inch seam is to move my needle over to the right. So I'm gonna do that. And if you see, I moved it to stitch 20 on my Viking, and then my needle is now a little bit further to the right. And now if I use the edge of the presser foot, because the needle moved over 1/8 inch, I am 1/8 inch closer, and I will be able to sew with a nice accurate 1/4 inch seam. So I'm gonna find my pedal, I've lowered my presser foot, I'm gonna find my pedal, and I'm going to sew all the way down that pinned edge. And don't forget to backstitch. You wanna backstitch in the beginning, and you wanna backstitch at the end. And what is backstitch? I teach backstitching that you come forward about 5 stitches, you backstitch, which means go backwards on top of those 5 stitches all the way back to the top, and then you proceed to sew your line. So here we go. Also keep in mind that here I'm using yellow thread, but I would highly recommend that you find thread that matches your project, or at least is a neutral. I'm using yellow so that you can see it as I work along. So I'm going to go forward. I'm gonna hit my backstitch button, I'm gonna backstitch back to the top, and I'm gonna sew my seam. The whole time my eyes are right here. I don't watch the needle, I'm watching the edge of my presser foot to keep my fabric along the side. And if this is another tricky thing for you, I always love putting a piece of tape down. I have tons of washi tape, which is that decorative tape for scrapbooking and journaling. And very often for my students, I'll rip a little piece of washi tape and I'll put it right along that edge. So there's a really visual line. The edge of my fabric is against the edge of that tape. And if you don't have washi tape, you can use anything from a Post-it to a piece of masking tape. And there's even these handy dandy magnets that they use with a flat edge for you to keep your fabric against. Go all the way to the edge. Now, if you notice, I'll take my fabric out, I'm gonna cut my threads nice and short, come back over here to where I started, cut those threads. Now, if you noticed, my fabric is uneven. Their edges are uneven. That's okay, because we're actually gonna go and we're gonna trim these, but what you really wanna aim for is making sure that you keep your pieces nice and even. So if you can see my nice yellow stitch, it's a little off, that ruler marking I made, but honestly, I probably marked that a little funky. I've trimmed my threads, and now I'm gonna keep going right ahead and sewing all of my strips together. And because they were right sides together, when I open it up, there's my nice straight seam that I sewed. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna sew the other pieces that I have pinned, and then I will meet you over at the iron, because that is our next step, is to iron all of our seam allowances. So here I am over at my ironing board. My iron is on the cotton setting because I've been using cotton fabrics. I always make sure that my iron is facing away from me, which you can see all my plants in the windows. Ooh, that one needs water. But anyway, I am over the ironing board, and what you should see is you should have a really nice straight stitch that is pretty close to the edge on these. If you don't have a nice straight stitch, or if your stitch starts straight and then starts to veer in or comes off, you either have to re-sew it, which if it goes down and comes off the fabric, you're going to want to re-sew. But if you go in, you're going to have to get your seam ripper out and take out the section that is too far in. But if you have some nice straight lines, let's work on ironing them. So what you're going to do is take your piece and you're going to open it up, and you're going to put it face down. So the good side is down, the right side is down. And we're looking at the seam allowances. See these guys poking up? Those are our seam allowances, and we are going to press them what we call open. And the word press is what we use when we talk about ironing. So I'm going to take my fingers and I'm going to push open my seam allowances like a book with my fingers first. And then I'm going to grab the iron and I'm going to iron straight up the center. And I'm gonna make sure it's nice and flat, and that everybody stay flat. See how nice and flat those are? So that when I flip it over, look how beautiful that looks. That looks great, except for that little thread. Looks fantastic. And now that I've got it nice and flat, I'm gonna hit it one more time with my iron, and that looks fabulous. Now let's pay attention to the difference between that guy and this guy. Can you see the difference? Let's take the time to iron. If you're at home, remember to be very careful with the iron. It is one of the most dangerous tools in our sewing studio. The metal part that is around the rim of the iron and that metal plate over here is extremely hot, and you should only ever hold the iron by your hand. And when you're finished, it always lives back upright. Most irons have a safety device that if you leave them flat for a while, but there's a good chance you're gonna smell burning stuff before it totally cools itself off. So iron always lives upright and facing away against the wall. So I'm going to go ahead and sew the rest of my pieces, and I'm going to iron everybody into pairs, and then we're going to talk about building our block a little bit more. Here we are back again on our table with two of our pairs that have been sewn together. Still got this little extra guy. So what am I going to do with him? Well, it looks like this guy should get sewn to this dark floral piece right here. So I'm going to line it up right next to that piece. I'm gonna flip them so that they are right sides together, and just like before, I'm gonna line up this side nice and even, so I shouldn't see any fabric poking out. And can you see how I know that some of my strips are longer than others, so I'm gonna make sure that I even them up as best I can so that when I trim my block later, I don't have any issues. And we're gonna pin to sew. So your pins are pointing in, the ball hangs off the edge so that we can see it while we're sewing, because remember, we don't sew over our pins, so I hope you didn't do that the first time around. And here we are. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew this guy, and then we're gonna put this whole block onto this block. Oh geez, I had a hiccup. If you take a look, I wasn't really doing a good job at paying attention while I sewed the seam, and I was going straight for a while, and then I veered into my project. So see how that line curves out, and see how fat this is? And if you take a look, if I fold it, see the difference where those lines are? That's gonna make a difference in our finished piece. It's not gonna lay flat with something like this, so I have to get my seam ripper and take this out. Also, if we open it up and you take a look, can you see the there's like a bubble. It wants to bubble up. I don't know if that really communicates well in a video, but right here there's kind of a bubbly look, and look how crooked that looks. See how the sides are kind of going in? We don't want that. So I'm gonna grab my seam ripper, and here you can see it really clearly here, and I'm gonna rip out this whole section here. I don't have to take this out because I did a good job here, but over here I totally messed it up, so I need to fix it. All right, here's my finished block. See how my edges are so much straighter and all of the seams are nice and straight in the center? I love it. I think it is so cute, and I'm gonna trim all of this off in just a second. But first, I'm gonna go ahead and make my other 4 blocks for my Scrappy pillow in the same manner. And I'm gonna make sure that none of my blocks are the same. I'm gonna alternate fabrics. I'm gonna make sure that there's some thick and thin because I really love how that looks. And I will meet you back here after we have sewn all of our blocks together. So here you are. You have all of these adorable strip piece blocks, and you can see mine. I had one where I kept them a little wide, and I have 4 strips. Here was the first one we did together. I repeated fabrics I really liked, but I made sure to put them in different positions, and I definitely changed it up a little bit with the width. So if you did not do that, that's totally okay. You're gonna have some really nice uniform looking blocks, and at the very end of it, you should have 4. So now let's talk about how we're gonna trim these to size. So again, there are 2 ways that we can go about doing this. The easier way, and the way that all quilters usually square off their blocks, is they use their quilting ruler, drop something, their quilting ruler and their rotary cutter, which let me show you how I'm gonna square off one of these blocks doing that. So first, I'm gonna line this up. Oh, I have some threads I really gotta trim. Make sure you trim your threads, guys. Give your project a haircut. So I'm gonna use one of the straight edges down here, and I'm gonna line up the straight edge of my ruler, and I'm only gonna trim to the shortest piece. So see how this piece is my shortest piece? Make sure I'm nice and straight, weight on the ruler, rotary cut right across. Oop, I didn't quite get it. I still got my weight on the ruler. That happens. Sometimes I go in with a pair of scissors. So there's a square bottom, and now I'm going to decide here and now what size my blocks are going to be. We only did a 4 block pillow, so it's not going to be a huge pillow, but it's fun to use up little scraps that we have here. You can always make more blocks and keep building your pillow bigger. But for now, if we look at our pillow, what I did across is they are just over 6 inches. Right? Yep. So I'm at the end here, and I measure up to here. There's 6 inches, and we're just past it. So I'm actually going to cut all of my pieces into 6 by 6 inch squares. If you do not have 6 inches, that's totally fine. Find the biggest measurement that you can make them and cut them all the same size. So here is that. My ruler is 6 inches wide, so I know I can lay this down over here and square off like this. And there is one of my blocks. Isn't she cute? Now, an alternative way to go through and square off your pieces is to make yourself a piece of paper pattern, pinning it and cutting it out. And let me show you how that's going to work. So I've got my tracing paper here, and I'm gonna only need a little bit, so let's scroll this up so we can get to that. Now, if you don't have a big piece of tracing paper, that's okay. Use any sort of paper or newspaper or magazine paper that you have lying around. I'm just, I buy this stuff in massive bulk, so it's just always the thing I make my patterns on. Now, if you don't have a clear see-through ruler, it's gonna be a little tricky to make a right angle or a squared edge. So if you don't have one of these guys, I recommend grabbing something that you know is square. Like this envelope, for example. I've just had this lying around, and this would make a good square template. You can also use books or, oh goodness gracious, other boxes, anything that you've got that can make a right angle, which is the bottom of this. But I'm gonna use my ruler first. So from this top edge, I'm gonna make a 6-inch block. So from that top edge, I'm gonna measure out 6 inches. 6 inches here, and I'm gonna measure 6 inches here, and then I'm gonna draw that nice straight line in between those 2 pieces. Then I'm gonna make one mark maybe right over here, and if you see, to use the clear ruler, you line up one of the straight lines with one of the lines that you've drawn, and you can, oop, I ripped my paper. Oh well, it's okay, I didn't rip my pattern, did I? Only a little bit, that's okay. Waste not, want not. So there's my straight edge, and then I can go over with my 6 inches and measure here and here, and draw that line. Or if you don't have a straight ruler, what you could have done is you measure this line first and then you lay this guy right on the edge there and use this edge to draw your straight line. So you have no excuse for not making a nice squared pattern piece. But here we go, let's make that guy. And then I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna cut this rectangle, or it's not a rectangle, it's a 6x6 square. I'm gonna cut this 6x6 square out and grab my blocks again. So here's my 6x6 inch square. If you are doing a smaller block, obviously make your square a smaller block, or if you got really excited and you made longer, taller pieces, these can be even bigger. Just keep in mind that whatever this is, times 2 is what your pillow is going to be tall. So, and this pillow has to be made with squares. It doesn't really work out if we don't use squares. So I've got the piece already cut, so I'm gonna put that over there. Let's grab another one. We'll put this guy down right here. Now, what I'm gonna do is lay my pattern piece right on top, and if you can see, my pattern piece is just big enough to fit. And this is also good to have around when you're sewing all your pieces together, because then you can make sure that all of your blocks are going to be big enough. Now I really like this floral, so I'm going to make sure that I have enough of that, and I'm going to use that straight edge. My pattern piece is completely on the project. It's lined up at the edge here. Ideally, it's not like that, but I don't quite have enough space to get it all the way on. And I'm gonna pin to cut my pattern piece out. So I'm gonna grab my pins and I'm gonna pin, making sure that every corner gets a pin. You definitely want pins down in the corners. Pin in this corner, pin in this corner. And once I have this all pinned up, I'm gonna go right ahead and cut it out. And ideally, let's put pins in between all of these pins, because I really hate not having enough pins. All right, so I'm not gonna cut this edge because my pattern piece is pretty much flush with that edge, but I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna cut all the other edges. So see, you don't need a rotary cutter to do quilting. It's helpful, but you don't need it. And there is my new, oh, we gotta cut that a little bit. And you wanna make sure you cut as straight as possible, guys. You don't want to get a wobbly block. It will not look good when you're done. So you can take all your pins out. And here is block number 2. Can you tell the difference? Barely at all. So I'm gonna go ahead and square off all my other blocks, and then I will show you what we're gonna do next. So here are all my beautiful blocks, all trimmed to the same square size. Now it's time for me to decide what I want my pillow to look like. The general rule with this guy is that we were going to do 2 on top, 2 on the bottom, and the 2 on top are going to be going in opposite directions. And then the 2 on the bottom are also going to be going in opposite directions, but opposite the top. So I got vertical, horizontal, horizontal, vertical. And if you don't like it the way it is, you can flip some of the pieces around, which I think I kind of like that. I think I kind of like that. So that is what my pillow is going to look like. Now, you guessed it, we're going to sew them together. We're going to work in pairs again. We're going to sew these 2 together, and we're going to sew these 2 together. So to sew these 2 together, what am I going to do? I'm going to flip them right sides together, and I'm going to pin this side. Same thing with this guy. I'm going to flip them right sides together, and I'm going to pin this side. And then we can go and sew those with the same 1/4 inch seam allowance that we did for all of our strips. Hey, so we're back at the sewing machine. I took the time to make sure that my pinned edges were nice and aligned evenly. And you also want to make sure that everybody's square elsewhere. So if you look, all of my pieces are nice and square. So just like we did with our strips, we're going to sew down the pin edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to use the presser foot edge here, and I also have a piece of tape down to help me. And we're not going to forget to back stitch, right guys? And I'm going to sew both of these pieces. Here I am. Oh, let's get those threads. There we go. All right, so now I'm gonna go over to the iron. I'm gonna iron those seams that I just sewed open, and I'm gonna pin these together to one another. We are getting there to a finished pillow front. Isn't this exciting? Now, you guessed it, we have pressed our two blocks sewn together super nicely. And I said when I was at the sewing machine that you want to press this seam open, but if you notice, it's actually easier to just press it in one direction, especially with all of these seams going this way. So I just pressed, this is the seam I just sewed, I pressed it in one direction. What you want to do is just make sure it's nice and flat. You do not want bubbly, wrinkly pieces when you're sewing them all together. So here it is. This is what it's going to look like. I'm almost done. Do I like it that way? Did I have it differently? Who knows, man? Was it like this? Oh, I feel like it was like this. No, I don't like those two touching. Let's play with this for a second. Nope, that wasn't it. Yeah, that was it. All right, here we go. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take this guy. I'm going to flip them right sides together. So if you saw, I took this like a pancake and flipped it over, and because it was down here, I'm going to pin this edge to sew. I'm going to stitch it up, and then I will show you my beautiful finished quilt block, pillow block, whatever you want to call this. My scrap-a-doodle-doo pillow block. All right, you ready for the big reveal? Here is my final finished block. Now I did 6 by 6 inch blocks that when they sew together, this is a 12.5 by 12.5 big pillow. Now, if that's too small for you, you can absolutely go ahead and keep reading your scrap pile and make a few more. You can make it more rectangular by adding 2 pieces up here or over here. You could do 5 more and get an even bigger pillow, or to begin with, you could cut your strips bigger and have a bigger block. So remember, I cut my strips about 6 or 7 inches long, and if I wanted to make this bigger, I would have cut it maybe 8 or 9, so I can cut maybe a 7 or 8 inch long block. So it really, the size of your strips really dictate how long and how big your blocks are going to be. So now I'm going to grab my backing fabric and we're going to turn this into a pillow. So here is our finished quilt block and the backing fabric that I raided my scrap bin for so I can make the back of my pillow. Now you don't have to turn this into a pillow, you can turn it into anything else your heart desires, but today we're going to go over how to turn it just into a basic pillow that we hand sew closed. So what I'm going to do is pull this out of the way, and I'm going to open up my backing fabric so it's nice and flat on the table all the way out, and you can see I got a really big piece here, so I am going to make sure that when I put my pattern piece on top, which is my quilt front, I'm going to place it up in the top corner so that I don't waste a lot of fabric. If I stuck this right in the middle, I would waste a whole bunch of space around it. With I do this, look how much I get to save. So I always like being really thrifty about my cutting. Now, we are not going to make a pattern to cut this guy out. We're actually just going to use the front of our pillow, our quilt block, to do so. So we're going to make believe that this is a paper pattern. We're going to grab our pins. I have placed them right sides together. So this is the right side of my backing fabric and this is the right side of my quilt block, and they are sandwiched together. And we are going to pin to cut, which means my pins are going to go along the inside of my pillow front, and we're going to pin all the way around, making sure it's nice and flat. Make sure you take your hands and tug it out to make sure it is flat so that they are the same size when we are done cutting. Now that I'm all pinned out, I am going to take my scissors and cut around the edge of my pillow front. Be careful not to chop into your pillow front. The one risk that we run when we take this type of technique and we use our pillow front to cut our pillow back out is that if you're not paying attention, you can cut into your fabric. And my friends, there is a reason we say measure twice and cut once. It is because you cannot undo a cut. You can sew things back together, but it's always going to be visible. So take your time cutting this. All right, now that I'm all cut out, my pieces are the same, and luckily they're actually already right sides together, but my pins are not the correct way. So I'm gonna take my pins out and I'm gonna flip them, and I'm gonna add pins to places I need them so that they are to sew, so that I can go all the way around this pillow and sew it together. Now that I'm all pinned up, I'm gonna establish what I want the bottom of my pillow to be. So let's just say right here. And I'm gonna make sure that I leave myself about a hand's width of space, And I like to denote that space with a double pin. So see how I stuck 2 pins and 2 pins? That's how I know that that is my hole. So we're gonna sew this together, you guessed it, using the edge of the presser foot as our guide. Where am I gonna start? Let's think about it for a second. Now, we are gonna pivot on all our corners, but you never really wanna start on a corner when you're doing a square pillow. So I'm gonna start next to the hole. If I was to set this up in the sewing machine, right here is where I wanna start, because I will start sewing and I will be able to pivot through all my corners. Let's go to the sewing machine and stitch this baby up. We are here back at the sewing machine on the last little bit of sewing that has to be done for our pillow, and what I'm trying to do now is find what side I pinned on my pillow to be the hole. Ah, here it is. See my double pins now? What we are going to do is I'm going to start sewing on this side of the hole, and I'm going to walk you through pivoting, which is how we turn a corner in sewing. So this is where my hole begins. Let me straighten out that pin so it's not so awkward. And if you watch, we're gonna line it up under the presser foot just like we did when we sewed all those strips, and the hole is back here, not in front of us, but behind the presser foot. And I'm gonna get all lined up. We can actually take these pins out before we get started. I'm gonna lower my presser foot. I am going to backstitch like always, and we are going to stop when we get 1/4 of an inch from the edge on our corner. So if you look over here, this is the corner we're gonna pivot on. I'm gonna grab my ruler and measure 1/4 of an inch to help myself have a guide. I do this a lot for new students who are still getting used to visualizing turns on the sewing machine. So that is where I'm going to sink my pin or my needle and turn with a pivot. So here we go. We're going to start sewing. We're going to backstitch. And we're going to sew right up to that line. When I get to that line, I am going to make sure that my needle is down. That is the most important part of any pivot, is that the needle is down and in the fabric. Then I am going to reach over and lift up my presser foot. I am going to turn my whole fabric, and I'm going to take a look at how I'm lined up now. So here I am facing the other way. I was coming down this way and I pivoted, but if you can see, my needle actually isn't on my 1/4 inch mark. I'm a little short. So I'm going to turn back, lower my presser foot, and I'm going to walk it forward by turning the knob. And I'm going to do that until I sink it. I can see right into that orange. So my needle is down, my presser foot comes up. I'm going to turn my fabric, and now you can see I'm really nice and aligned. And look, my edge of my fabric is on the edge of my guide over here. Same thing up here. The edge of my fabric is on the edge of my presser foot, and then I can keep sewing. Now we're going to turn a corner here without me drawing a line. We're going to figure out how we turn, because we saw before that when we turned, our presser foot was on the edge of the fabric. So let's go. And I feel like I'm almost there. Let's sink the needle down before we turn a corner, presser foot up and turn. And you know what? I would say that that is pretty darn good. So I'm going to keep sewing. Okay, so at this point you have sewn all the way around your pillow, and you stopped when you got to your other double pins so that there is a hole for you to be able to turn your pillow right side out. But before we do that, we have to trim our corners. So I don't know if you can see here that well, but can you see the extra fabric around my corner? We're gonna cut a diagonal line across that so that we can reduce the bulk so that our corners turn out really nice when we go to turn our pillow out. So I'm just gonna take my scissors and cut right across. And just so you can see, the most important thing about this is that you don't cut your stitches. Oh my sweet Jesus, don't cut your stitches. You cut your stitches, you put a hole. hole. Then you gotta re-sew it and you make your pillow smaller. So I'm gonna go ahead and very carefully cut all of my corners. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm gonna reach inside that lovely little hole that I left that is just big enough for my hand, and I'm gonna turn my whole pillow right side out. Let's do it, baby. Yay! What you do need at this point is you gotta get your hand inside and you wanna poke out those corners so they look like nice corners. But an extra handy tool to have around is, I wonder where my chopstick is, but you know what? I can't find my chopstick. If you have a chopstick, that does the job really well, but I'm just gonna grab a pencil that's kind of blunt and gently poke out my corners. I do not recommend that you use scissors. I don't even really recommend that you use a pencil, but I can't reach anything right now and I wanna get this done. So close. But you do wanna poke out your corners so they look nice. Look, that's one that I didn't poke out, that's one I did. Can you see the difference? It's a huge difference. So we're gonna poke out the corners, and at this point, we can stuff it. So I'm gonna grab my big box of eco-friendly fiber fill, which is made of corn fibers, and I am going to stuff this pillow until I am so happy with how fluffy it is. And you stuff yours, and then we are going to hand sew it closed, because that is one of the best ways to finish a pillow so you don't get a big ugly machine stitch on it. Alrighty? See you in a second. We are in the home stretch, guys. All we have left to do is hand sew the opening of our pillow closed. Now, if you look inside, I use scraps and all different types of stuff to stuff my pillows. And keep in mind that that is a great way to recycle more scraps and make this the ultimate scrap busting project. What you're gonna need to hand sew it closed is your hand sewing needle, thread that matches your project. I'm gonna use orange here because I want you to be able to see this. Pair of scissors and some pins. We're gonna start by taking the top, and if you watch my fingers, I fold in the raw edges of my pillow so that I can't see any of them before I sew this closed. And I'm gonna grab a few pins and I'm gonna pin right through all of those layers. So this is a little tricky, but worth it so that you don't see any raw edges when you sew your pillow closed. Doesn't that look great? Now you're gonna grab your thread and you're gonna cut a pretty long piece of thread and thread up your needle. And when you're done, you'll tie a knot. On one end. I always like to tie a knot on one end of my thread and leave the other one kind of short so that I can gain more thread as I'm sewing. And what we're gonna do is a really simple whip stitch. So grab the top of your pillow, and what you're gonna do is find the end of the hole. Here is the end of my hole right here. And I'm actually going to come from the inside. So I don't know if you can see this, but I'm going to come up in between the fold that I created and come out right on the ridge of the fold from the inside to the outside so you can't see my knot. Now I am going to incrementally work my way across the fold. So I am right-handed, I'm gonna work to the left, and I came out right here. So now I'm gonna move over a little bit and I'm going to go front to back through both layers and pull tight. And again, I'm gonna move over just a little bit, front to back through both layers and pull tight. And what I want you to notice is how close together my stitches are. Can you see that? You don't want to go any further than a 1/4 inch apart because you don't want holes and the stuffing inside your pillow to come falling out. So I'm going to work my way all the way across the top of this pillow. There are other hand sewing stitches you can use to close this up. I'm a big fan of an invisible ladder stitch, which I will show you in another video. But a whip stitch in matching thread really is pretty inconspicuous. You can see I've kind of got a thread here from when I tied my knot. So let me grab my scissors and fix that. But you go ahead and sew all the way across. Don't forget to tie a knot at the other end of your hole, which is right over here. And I can't wait to see your finished project. So here I am at the last stitch that I have to take in order to close my pillow up. I'm going to stick my needle halfway through so the point is sticking out, and I'm going to grab the working thread on the side with the point, which is right over here, and I'm going to wrap my working thread around the point. 1, 2, 3 times would be a good knot. And then I'm going to pull the thread down like this towards my pillow, grab the point of the needle, and continue pulling my thread out. And that gives me a nice little knot right here, right up against my project, and I can cut my thread. You always have to tie knots so that nothing falls apart when you make your pillow. All right, there she is. She's a beaut. Oh my gosh, I absolutely love her. I hope you had fun making her. Are you so impressed with yourself? This was a fun project. I really hope that you enjoyed it. There was a lot of sewing that went into this guy and lots of pieces to make a whole. Now, I love strip piecing, but if you hit a bump on the road, if you hit a bump on the road, anyway, if you have a problem while you are sewing this, guys, please comment below. I am totally gonna get back to you. You can also email me at julia@oldspoolnj.com. You can follow me on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook. All my information is in the description below. Also, if you liked this video and hit that subscribe button, I would really appreciate it. I'm having so much fun bringing sewing videos to everyone while we're all quarantined and cooped up. I got lots of free time. If you have any ideas for more tutorials, I'd love to hear them. And as always, my name is Julia, and I am coming at you from Old Spool Sewing Studio in beautiful Brielle, New Jersey. Happy stitching!